The Witch from Mercury is the most recent series adaptation of Mobile Suit Gundam, and I have to say it's easily the most divisive series that Gundam has had since Gundam Seed. I do think, though, that a majority of people were quite disappointed with something about the show in one form or another once it ended. I think many people can also agree that, in the end, the show really didn't hit the high marks that a lot of us were hoping it was going to hit. For today's video, I'm going to take a little bit of time to discuss the ups and downs of The Witch from Mercury, but more than anything try and talk about where it fell short. Obviously, the show was a monetary success given how much they sold when it came to model kits and merch. But just because something is a fiscal success does not mean it is a creative success. Keep in mind that Metallica's Saint Anger went platinum in sales 6 times, somehow won a Grammy Award, and it's not a good album by any stretch of the imagination. The same could be said of the video game Halo 5, which sold over 5 million copies and is detested as the worst Halo game ever. It was so bad that they had to basically replace Evil Cortana with Jen Taylor being the biggest sweetheart of an AI that's ever been in fiction, to my recollection. I'm surprised she didn't give everyone who played Halo Infinite the beatus. Before we begin, I have to be honest with the fact that I'm going to have a hard time being the wise ass that I usually am when it comes to this video. I'll get to the reasons why in a sec, but let's just get straight to what we're talking about today. What I want to do is break down my thoughts on G-Witch's shortcomings in 3 different sections. We're going to start by talking about the Zeitgeist, which is why it took me so long to do this review. Then we're going to talk about where G-Witch fell short, but we're going to end by talking about its positives. So I'm going to do something that I do really well, and be blunt right out of the gate. If you're one of those types of people who hold the concept of representation, and you can hear my air quotes there, much higher than anything else present in fiction, like characterization or pacing or things of that nature, this is your stop. It's nothing personal, but I don't care about representation. I'm not the type of person who complains about having a bunch of people with different backgrounds in a show, or complains because people of my ethnicity, I'm of Jewish descent, not being in a show, because ultimately it doesn't matter. As long as a show is compelling and interesting, I couldn't really give a damn less about how many colors of the rainbow the cast is. So, if that's not the kind of review you want to watch, I'm just going to reiterate that this is your stop. Now, discussion about this particular show was always going to be divisive because it was coming out in possibly the worst era to release a show with a female protagonist. By the way, that's not me saying that you can't do such a thing or shouldn't. If female protags can carry games like Resident Evil or Metroid, or films like G.I. Jane or Alien, there's no reason that the main protagonist of a Gundam show can't be a woman. At least that's my logic. It's me saying that if you decide to do something like that, you're gonna get a lot of internet weirdos coming along and making claims about the series that just aren't true. There were immediately articles saying that Suletta was the first female Gundam pilot ever, when Sayla Mass piloted the Gundam in the original show on occasion, plus you have characters like Emma Sheen, Ru Luca, Elviano, and more in Zeta and Double Zeta decades before this show. This sort of thing is a bit annoying because you can tell these folks are trying to muscle in with the sort of stuff that A, indicates a fake fan, and B, someone who is more interested in an injection of their personal politics into something to claim that it's theirs because of representation. The reason I gave everyone a warning that this is where their stop was, if that matters to them, is because I think representation as an idea is short-sighted. First and foremost, the only societal change that's been brought on by injecting bumper sticker politics into the media is just dividing everyone in the West from one another instead of bringing people together. The second problem is that representation without consideration for the quality of storytelling is a betrayal to the people you're trying to represent. If it's not up to snuff, what you think you're telling the world with claiming a character might not be what you think. In the case of one character in this show, you claiming her as one of your own as a lesbian basically means that you're claiming that someone that's incredibly abusive and unkind is a pinnacle of representation. Then again, when it comes to Miarina, I guess maybe she's reflective of some statistics that show lesbian relationships, statistically speaking, can be incredibly abusive. There were also assumptions from people that it was going to be kowtowing to some sort of Western zeitgeist, when that line of thought means nothing considering it's written and produced in Japan, and primarily aimed at a Japanese audience. Now, I do think that there was some kowtowing to shippers at the end of it, but we'll get there. Honestly, the Western-centric mindset was so silly and egotistical, and really didn't have any sort of place in the discussion. It was just a bunch of noise, and when the show was over, all of these people from both sides of the political aisle here in the West ultimately just moved on to whatever the cause du jour was, because these people don't give a damn about the arts. They care about clicks. This essentially creates a bit of a conundrum in regards to any sort of discussion of the show. Here in the age of the internet, I very much believe that the worst thing to happen to nerd culture is the culture war YouTuber. On one political aisle, they're called breadtubers. On another political aisle, I'm not quite sure what to call them outside of just culture warriors. I don't know, but what I do know is I don't like any of their content. The reason is because these sorts of people get into fights over series and fandoms and whatnot that they aren't even part of in the first place. They just get involved for tribalistic reasons, political brownie points, and easy clicks on their newest rage bait video or boring video essay. Beyond that, their media literacy is usually nil, because one side is trying to act like the media has to conform to intersectionality or it hurts their feelings, and the other side is trying to act like media can't ever be what their constantly shifting idea of woke is and hurt their feelings. This is where the gatekeeping discussion came in, which of course distracted from the series that it was based around. I have the opinion at this point in my life that if you're interested in Mobile Suit Gundam, then go ahead and get into it. If you're not interested in Mobile Suit Gundam and you feel the need to comment on things you honestly have no idea about, please just go away. This includes any of the culture warriors, shippers, and any other cancerous forms of life. Does this include your favorite culture war content creator for those of you listening? Probably, and I don't care. I just want to enjoy the things that I enjoy without some idiot in a Che Guevara t-shirt or some idiot in a Donald Trump hat bothering me and yelling in my damn ear while I'm trying to watch robots blow each other up. With that in mind, it was absolutely impossible to really go on the internet and have a discussion about anything Gundam-oriented because so many of these outsiders were coming in and just heaping garbage that had nothing to do with the franchise into the community for basically no damn reason. Suddenly, fans of Mobile Suit Gundam had to deal with the No Fun Brigade, and it just made the experience a bit less enjoyable. Then there's the shippers. I despise shippers. And I despise them probably more than most forms of human life, because any single time that they don't get their way, suddenly social media becomes death threat central. The internet has many horror stories about shippers pressuring people into suicide or suicide attempts, plus throwing out death threats. These people are scum and deserve to be treated like scum. If you give them what they want, you encourage their psychotic behavior, and we'll get to that later, as I promised. Here's a news flash for you entitled little brats. You do not get to dictate how other people tell their stories, and you're going to have to live with the fact that your headcanon isn't always what other people have in mind. Get over it, get a job, and stop being such disappointments to your parents. The reason I'm bringing this up is because this injection of a zeitgeist that really had nothing to do with anything, and an honest review of this show was completely impossible. That's why I've waited nearly a year to re-review this series. So, let's get to the bulk of this. What The Witch from Mercury ended up being was an ultimately disappointing series that suffered from a lot of problems, mostly in regards to pacing and the inability to pull the trigger on the more intriguing themes that the story brings up at the start of it. The zeitgeist and all of the assumptions about what was here didn't really matter, because the truth of it is that the show just was an ultimate disappointment. But time has passed, and we're going to have this discussion now. That leads us to the next section. The more I think about this particular show, the more disappointed I get with it. Granted, I was a little uneasy when it came to The Witch from Mercury and its initial concept. The idea of a Gundam show taking place within a school that was focusing on duels and teaching kids how to become engineers felt a little too sci-fi Hogwarts for me. I never really wanted Gundam Harry Potter, and it honestly sounds like a bad idea. Then the prologue came out, and it was dark, intriguing, and seemed to promise a Gundam series that was more focused on concepts of transhumanism and an interesting new take on the Earth versus space conflict. I would argue that The Witch from Mercury's prologue is one of the top 5 best first episodes of a Gundam series ever. To call it incredible would be an understatement. The problem is that the show itself very rarely, if ever, followed up on it. The next things that we would be introduced to would be our lead character of Suletta Mercury, and the other 2 individuals she would be interacting with throughout the story. The main characters to mention here would be Miorina and Ghoul, who, at the opening of the show, were engaged to one another in an arranged marriage. When Suletta stands up to the brute's abuse, they have a duel in their mobile suits, and Suletta comes out the victor, and now has to take the betrothal that the bully once had. Going back and watching it again, the best description I really have of the next episodes, up until the season finale, can really be described as faffing about. The pace of the show slows down to a crawl, and focuses way too much on teenage-oriented drama, and not enough on anything that's actually interesting. There's a couple good episodes with a couple good fights and a chilling singing of Happy Birthday when someone's about to get deep fried, but we're talking about 2 episodes and a 10-episode stretch up to the season finale. That's a lot of time that gets wasted on things that ultimately ended up being completely inconsequential to the overall plot. Not to mention, when you only have 24 episodes to work with, you have to make every single one of them count. Let's compare that to something like Chainsaw Man. I know that might be an unfair comparison because Chainsaw Man is as good as it is, but both shows were out at the same time, and even as a Gundam fan, I couldn't keep my eyes off of Chainsaw Man. At the same time, there were points that I completely forgot that The Witch from Mercury was still going on. Chainsaw Man from front to back doesn't waste any time with its runtime. All of it is building towards the inevitable finale of that season and keeps a consistent tone and pace. It's a show that knows what it wants to be, and as such can move forward with a level of confidence. Anytime a creator knows the direction of what they're wanting to do and is 100% confident in it, it's going to show through the creation because you're not going to find any moments that seem to waste your time. You end up with something that we would call all killer, no filler. Now, admittedly, Chainsaw Man had the benefit of being a manga before an anime, so that context needs to be added, but I still think my point stands. The Witch from Mercury doesn't have that sort of confidence that Chainsaw Man does, especially considering some animation overworking that came near the end of the show. That's a big red flag that something got shifted last minute to kowtow to someone, meaning you compromised yourself as an artist. Now, the first season finale was actually tremendous. The conflict on Earth was finally coming to the stars, and we got a tense and fun battle sequence of Gundam on Gundam conflict. Then you have Ariel turning a guy into paste to save Miorina and her dad's life. The episode ending with the imagery of Suletta covered in blood with a giant smile on her face, and Miorina with this absolutely horrified look, was excellent television. It's a great way to cap off an action-packed season finale that really seemed like it was going to raise the stakes of the entire show. It seems like we're finally going to start seeing more of the political things that were alluded to within the prologue, alongside finally getting to see the war between Earth and space properly kick off. After that, it just didn't happen. Instead, the show just decides to go back to the status quo. Instead of an interesting cybernetic space war with Gundams, we just get more Hogwarts. Why? Why did we have to go back to the status quo? Why are we doing the less interesting thing? The weird thing about this is that this show came from the mind of the guy who wrote Code Geass, which is a show that always had a good sense of escalation. Here, we consistently would get moments of escalation and then the ball would get completely dropped on them. Because of that, the second season is a mess. It has the same issues of not really knowing what it wants to be. Does it want to be a serious war story that goes over the perils of the people on Earth and how they're treated by the people of space? Or does it want to have just teenage girl drama that never really seems to come to any sort of resolution until the show just wraps it up at the end with a time skip? I think the reason for this is that the writer assumed the vast majority of people were going to be so entranced by the relationships between our main characters that you're not going to care much about anything else. Here's the problem. The interpersonal stuff between Suletta and any possible romantic interests is ultimately uninteresting. Now, I imagine that some shippers are probably going to go absolutely bonkers in the comments section with me saying that, but shippers aren't people, so their words don't mean anything. The fact is, there was such little character chemistry that it was kind of embarrassing. Throughout the entirety of the show, the character of Suletta Mercury is the highlight. She's lovable, adorably naive, and loyal to a fault. During the course of the story, everyone seems to have a fascination with her, but the amount of people that actually start to see her as an actual person and not something that they can use is very small. It adds an element of tragedy to her existence that, when the show actually executed on it, could lead to some very powerful moments. Sadly, it really felt like those moments were there just to have a cliffhanger, instead of actually building towards something more interesting, or to a development that really meant anything in the long run or was ultimately satisfying. Even the revelations about what Ariel actually was seemed to be kind of lame in the end, because it wasn't used properly as a tool to add stakes to the conflict. Then she just ended up as a keychain. The other issue that the show had was that it couldn't really pick a conflict. It really felt like you had all these really cool things that were going on in the background, but it was struggling to really properly tie it into what we were seeing on a regular basis, aside from some kids from Earth getting made fun of for being poor. It was kind of obvious that Prospero was going to be our villain. She had all the traits of a Char clone that you would expect, and the ultimate plan of Quiet Zero was kind of interesting as a sort of digital afterlife that everyone would essentially be forced into in a weird Armageddon where everyone would just become Data. Then it just became the Death Star. The thing is, There was a lot more time that could have been spent showing our main villain manipulating things behind the scenes to get a certain outcome where we do have our big clash at the Death Star, like the very Star Wars that has inspired all of Gundam. There just wasn't an interesting build-up. Just a villain monologue at one point in an office, then a Gundam jack, then an attack on Earth that could have sparked an interesting conflict that went nowhere, and honestly happened several episodes after it should have. We never really got what felt like proper escalation outside of events, where the show remembered it's supposed to be Gundam. That's because, like I mentioned, the show spends too much time screwing around with the relationship, and I use that term loosely, between Suletta and Miorina. I don't know how people were convinced that this was a romance, let alone a good one. Now, to be fair, Gundam's never been that great with romance. The only relationship that I feel was actually interesting in a Gundam show compared to the overall plot were in G Gundam and Gundam X. During the course of G Gundam, you see our main characters in Domon and Rain consistently have their struggles, but you see a gradual growing together of the two, and even points of absolute devotion from an otherwise tsundere protagonist. In Gundam X, you see the absolute devotion of a character like Garrett as he's willing to put his life on the line for someone he knows needs protecting. That desire turns to love. Even in a show like Gundam Wing, there's interesting developments and disagreements between Hiro and Relina outside of, the attempted homicide at the beginning. Most of the time we get interactions between Miorina and Suletta, it's just Miorina being a bitch. Not a tsundere, a bitch. This isn't how you develop a relationship. Whether you're gay or straight or anything in between, the relationship that they're trying to put together doesn't feel like a relationship. It feels like Stockholm Syndrome. Because all we're seeing is this adorable little Tanuki that is way too good for this damn show, getting abused by some chick who is so far up her own colon that she can see what she's digested for lunch. What ends up happening in this is this supposed romance gets its one bit of development, and again I use that term loosely, at the 11th hour because the show is about to wrap up, and I guess we have to do this. Even then, it doesn't come across like a romantic moment. Just one girl giving another girl a pep talk because she's a bit sad that her ego got deflated. And if you think I'm being critical because it's supposed to be a gay romance, first off, fuck you.
If you're the type of person that thinks that somebody is bigoted just because they don't like a certain relationship in a certain piece of media, the person reviewing it is not the problem. You and your mental illness are the problem. That's not what bigoted behavior is, and you're lucky enough to live in a world where you don't have to experience the bigoted behavior that your grandparents probably had to deal with, asshole. Second, I'm actually going to take a little bit of time to compare this to a lesbian relationship in a piece of media that I actually like, specifically from Cyberpunk 2077 between a female V and Judy Alvarez. Now you might be asking, Micah, why that one? Well, it's quite simple, because that relationship is everything that this relationship between Suletta and Miorina isn't!
It's a gradual growing together where Judy slowly but surely comes out of her shell because she starts to realize that V isn't just there to make money, but she's there because she's someone who cares. Then, bit by bit, Judy starts to let V in because she realizes what she wants to have in her life. It's paced well, written well, and feels natural. The exact opposite of this supposed romance between Suletta and Miorina. Then, the ending of the show is just bad. Though it is quite fun to see a Gundam piloted by somebody who is called a witch, that has a cannon that's a witch's broom, the ending of the show was just rushed. The conflict between Ghoul and his brother felt random and was just an excuse to get another Gundam out there that they could print model kits of. It was stupid and unenjoyable, and honestly was a pointless way of keeping probably the most interesting character outside of Suletta out of the final conflict. The final conflict itself, with everything literally turning to dust, was well animated, but kind of made me feel like I wasted my time. Then there's the epilogue, where they take one of the bad guy characters and make him the scapegoat for everything, so nobody else gets punished for stupid crap that they did in the show. Oh, and all the actual romance happened off screen. Yeah, the ending of this show is just terrible. There's no real consequences for anything. There's no real interesting tidbits about what the future is going to hold, or if anybody really learned anything, or anything of that nature. The ending, just like the show, is too much fluff and nothing of substance. It just says that we're going to blame one guy for everything, then give you a stock, boring, happy ending. It is a slap in the goddamn face. What I find funniest about this is that Bandai Namco had to come out and flat out retcon the idea that Suletta and Miorina were married to one another and said it's just up for interpretation, even though the setup of the episode makes it pretty clear that that's where they were going. Now, the reason I find this funny has nothing to do with anybody's sexual orientation. It's not like we haven't had gay characters in Gundam before this show. What I find funny about that is that the ending was so bad and so poorly put together that the company that owns the IP had to basically say that one part of it that might be controversial to some isn't happening the way you're thinking it's happening. This set the entire internet ablaze, and I just laughed. Because if I got one thing out of the ending of that show, it was watching a bunch of shippers cry and whine on the internet and being treated like the subhuman garbage they are. That was a positive. And no, an art book or the writer saying they got married doesn't matter. Speaking of someone who owns intellectual property, by the way, links in the description, as the owner of that IP, I'm the one who has a say in what's canonical and what isn't. In fact, I have the final say. Here's an example. Let's say I hired a comic writer that I admire, like Christopher Priest or Jim Starlin, to write an installment of my comic book series, Englewood. Whatever happens in that book, as the owner of the IP, what I say goes, because the owner of the IP determines what's canon. It's how Disney was able to blink an entire Star Wars EU out of existence from canon with a word. They own the IP, so they get the final say. Ichiro Okuchiki doesn't own Gundam, and him saying the opposite, or the art of two girls in wedding dresses in an art book, doesn't mean anything either. That's like saying Judo Ashita is Greek because he wore a toga in an art book once, or Okawara saying that new types are Marxists means that Amuro Ray should start singing the national anthem of the USSR. Though that would explain why some new types become genocidal maniacs. Anyway, if Sunrise says it's up for interpretation, then it's up for interpretation. That's just the way that it is. Welcome to the brutal nature of intellectual property. If you don't own it, you're just a contractor. Cash the check and shut up. One thing to add is that apparently over 94 animators were brought in to work on the last episode, and it was the worst one. That and other several delays this show had while it was airing tell me right out of the gate that something changed at the last minute more than once. And given how it seems like the show's writer and directors since then have tried to kowtow to shippers, it seems like they caved. It also explains why the second season is so terrible. It makes the drop-off in quality from season 1 to 2 in Gundam 00 seem like a hiccup. This just shows that you shouldn't cave to the internet. And the writer, Ichiro Okuchiki, and the directors, Hiroshi Kobayashi and Ryo Ando, are complete and total fuck-ups for that. Fuck all three of you. Oh wait, you can't understand that. Well, I do speak a little Japanese. Anato wa saideta, baka. To sum it all up, the pacing of the show was awful. The characters outside of the main three were poorly undercooked and ultimately irrelevant, and the ending just makes you feel like you wasted your time. There's no satisfaction, no tackling of intriguing ideas, or anything like that. It all gets settled off screen, and like this entire show, you're saddled with the boring crap, while all the fun stuff happens somewhere else in the universe.
Screw you guys, I'm going home.
Now, I feel like what keeps this particular show from reaching the nadir of something like Gundam Seed is the fact that it does have some strong redeeming qualities. There are some episodes of this show that are so strong and so fun to watch that you can't really take your eyes off it, and they all happen in Season 1. Except for one of them. I already praised the prologue, and I really can't say enough good things about the Season 1 finale. There's also an episode with Ghoul in Season 2 that's probably the best one in the series because it tackles the conflict on Earth and the human element of that particular conflict. The unfortunate part is that it makes you wish that they were doing a lot more with that and a lot less with everything else. However, I feel like the highlight of the show is Suletta Mercury herself. She's one of those characters that I really feel is way too good for the show she's in. This character was one that I wanted to see on screen a lot more when she wasn't around. She was a fun character who honestly might be one of the sweetest, kindest female protagonists that I've seen in a long time, and because of that, she was a breath of fresh air. I genuinely did want to see this character find happiness as she went through a lot of the struggles that she went through, and I admittedly found myself siding with her whenever it came to a lot of the actions she had to take that were controversial within the universe itself. It just sucks that she essentially got roped into a abusive relationship because of shippers. Allegedly. There's other positives as well, with the sound design and the animation of the show being top-notch. The mecha design's not bad either, though I wouldn't put it super high on a tier list or anything like that. I'd say it's about on par with 00, and it honestly felt like it took a lot of notes from that sort of soft science that 00 uses, plus kind of the overall aesthetic of like the slim waist and kind of just skinnier robots. Ultimately, it's a show that had a really strong aesthetic to it, and I believe that is a big part of the reason as to why the model kits moved off the shelf so quickly. I'll freely admit that at some point I'll probably get the full mechanics version of the Gundam Ariel, just because I'm such a fan of the character of Suletta, and I would like representation of her on my shelf. Here's an idea for a Gundam show. Let's take characters that are too good for the universes they are in, let's take them out, Put them in a new universe that's a lot better. Let's do a war story with Suletta, joined by Maru Ramius as her captain, and Mula Flaga as her wingman in a cyberpunk-inspired Gundam show that fully explores the idea of Suletta being a pawn of her mother in an attempt to bring about societal change to get revenge for her dead husband. You know, what Witch from Mercury was supposed to be. Which sounds a lot more fun than what we ended up getting with the Witch from Mercury and from Gundam Seed. To wrap this all up, I feel like I'm doing an impression of my dad when I say I'm not really mad. Just disappointed. That's why I haven't been as much of a smartass in this. I really feel like we could have seen a neat and complex look at some themes that Gundam really had only brushed with in the past. Instead, it goes without saying that the writer on this show dropped the ball harder than Tony Khan drops the ball with AEW's booking. You have to take time and energy to tell a consistent story, and you have to tell it with confidence. And if this show really confirmed anything for me, it's that the writer for this show, Ichiro Okuchi, needs Goro Taniguchi to really hit the heights that he's capable of hitting as a creator. Hell, if you want a show that's about the same length as G-Witch that's a lot more consistent, go watch Gunsword instead. It's directed by Goro Taniguchi, and you'll notice that of he and Ichiro, he's clearly the one with a sense of pacing and character development. Plus that confidence I mentioned earlier that, in my opinion, every creator really needs. On that note, guys, I want to thank you all so much for watching this. I have a feeling people are going to be mad. I don't really care, because this is just me being honest, and that's all I can do at the end of the day. Anyways, to support the channel will be down in the description, such as Patreon, Subscribestar, and, of course, any comic books that are on sale at the moment will be down in the description as well. So, with that said, my name is Micah Curtis, Very Vanilla Gorilla. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.